Gamergate 2.0 is upon us. People are talking about like, oh, Sweet Baby Incorporated. Yeah. Like, oh man, this is the next big thing. This is the conspiracy. Oh, look at all these people getting exposed. This person is associated with Zoe Quinn, and like we're seeing a lot of familiar names with Gamergate. Yeah, like again, this goes back to what I was saying like earlier this year when I made that video talking about like the upcoming Gamergate anniversary, the 10-year anniversary of Gamergate. I kind of addressed this a little bit in that video where I talked a little bit about how game journalists completely failed to disregard Gamergate, right? They never really successfully managed to convince the public that Gamergate's concerns were wrong or incorrect, right? All they did was just kind of write articles about how Gamergate wasn't accomplishing anything and how all their arguments were wrong and how like the gaming journal how gaming was better than ever. And over the past 10 years, it's become more and more obvious that Gamergate was right about everything, right? We've seen situations like The Last of Us Part 2 and Saints Row and now Suicide Squad. And now we're seeing that, like, there's an entire conspiracy of people pushing this stuff into games. Now, like, let's be clear here. Like, we should not lay all of the blame on Sweet Baby Incorporated, right? Because they are a consulting firm, and consulting firms have to be hired by the studios that utilize their services, right? So companies like Naughty Dog, like WB, like Larian, Valve, like they specifically sought out Sweet Baby's advice, right? Like allegedly because they were going around like doing the SJW thing of like, oh, we're gonna come after you if you don't use us. But um, the reality is, this is the same kind of thing we saw in Gamergate, right? The problem didn't go away necessarily, but people began to acknowledge it as a problem, right? And this goes into what I was saying, right? Gamergate didn't lose, it evolved, right? People involved with Gamergate moved on to bigger and better things, the 2016 election, the 2020 situation, and now what we're doing now, right? Like, Gamergate was a big deal. Right, a major cultural shift, in my opinion, where people began to realize the agenda that's being pushed in entertainment onto an unsuspecting population, right? The main thing that's changed 10 years later is that the population is no longer unsuspecting, right? If you either know about the propaganda or you support it, there's really no in between, right? That's kind of the issue we're seeing now. That's the major shift we've seen in the culture over the past decade is that like you either support it or you hate it. There is no middle ground at this point, right? You're either an establishment shill, right? You're either Angry Joe or the Act Man or any other major YouTuber, or you're the hardcore countercultural, like, big dick YouTubers who just go against the grain, like everyone else, like, the smaller YouTubers that are addressing the situation, right? Dozens and dozens of us. Like, people like the Act Man cannot damage control for Sweet Baby. IGN cannot damage control for Sweet Baby. That's a thing that a lot of people are addressing. Like, oh, gaming journalism isn't covering this. Well, of course they're not. Gaming journalism is corrupt. I thought we established that a long time ago, right? This is honestly, I would say this is a bigger deal than Gamergate because gaming journalism lost all of its credibility during the Gamergate saga. Like, whenever they come out in defense of something like Sweet Baby, whenever they come out in defense of like Suicide Squad or anything the industry is doing, right? Whenever they do this, like, most people just like throw back their heads and laugh, right? Like, nobody who's been paying attention respects these people at all, right? It's becoming more and more common knowledge, like who these people are, how they operate, how they try to manipulate people, their stunts, and just they haven't changed at all, right? Like, these people legit believe what they're doing is for the good of the gaming industry. They genuinely think that what they're doing is going to like and usher in like a new golden age of like equality in the gaming sphere. Diversity, inclusion, and equity. DIE. like DIE for white people. DIE white people. Like, That's legit what they're doing, right? That's legit like what they believe, what they're promoting, what they're pushing onto people, right? And they'll try to they'll try to manipulate every media franchise and property they can. Now, like they seem to be relatively relegated to like the Western video game space. There's not a whole lot of stuff I see from like the Japanese side of things that like I would consider as bad as like a Suicide Squad, but like we're getting there for sure, but like on the other side of the spectrum, right? Like when you look at like what's happening with the Western side of things, right? You know, the stuff where this stuff is really entrenched. Like we're seeing more and more that like this stuff cannot get the momentum it used to, right? When The Last of Us One came out like pre Gamergate, you know, it came out in 2013, like a year before Gamergate. You know, that game was worshipped. Like people really bought it, like hook, line, and sinker. That this was like the greatest story in gaming, right? You know, the Citizen Kane of video games. You know, Neil Druckmann is gonna be, you know, the biggest video game auteur in the world. You know, bigger than Kojima, right? That was the narrative going into this. What's happened since then? The Last of Us Part 2 came out. The show came out. Naughty Dog laid off a bunch of people. Like, they haven't produced anything since, like, the Golden Globe Awards. And that came immediately after, like, the Game Awards came out and shilled for them, right? Like Naughty Dog, and recently Neil Druckmann coming out and saying, I don't know if I have any more games in me, guys. You know, all that worship, all that praise, all that hype, all that like, oh, like this is as good as Hollywood style, like Hollywood or what Hollywood puts out, like you know, all of that like all that stuff amounted to nothing, right? Like Neil Druckmann never even came close to his real goal of like making it in Hollywood, right? None of these people did, right? They get no respect in that sphere at all, and like they shouldn't, right? They couldn't make it in Hollywood, which is why they tried to make it in games, and they didn't make it in games either, even though they had like so many people just bending over in front of them like oh stick it in me, Neil, like that dude did to Abby, like just stick it in, Neil, give it to me, Neil, like you had so many people doing that. And what happened? Neil Druckmann is now a joke, right? And he's not the only one, right? But like he is a particularly blatant example of what the general scene is like right now, right? When it comes to like the modern Western video game industry, is that people are rejecting the vast majority of woke games. Now there are like a handful of exceptions. You know, Baldur's Gate 3 was like really hyped, but like those games don't live up to expectations either. Like if people pretend those games aren't woke, they're like delusional. And I think that'll become like more and more apparent when like the sequels start coming out, or maybe if people put more than 5 hours into Baldur's Gate 3, they'll start figuring it out. But like uh, the reality is, yeah, there's so many issues with the modern Western video game world. Like, I don't think Sweet Baby Incorporated can be blamed for most of them, right? Because Sweet Baby didn't exist until 2018, right? Sweet Baby wasn't around when Gamergate came out. It wasn't shilling for Destiny. It wasn't like promoting The Last of Us. It wasn't like behind uh wasn't behind Mass Effect, right? Like, how many people today will you even acknowledge that like Mass Effect is unbelievably woke, right? Like, you know, the magic space lesbian space elves that like are the most benevolent, kind, wise rulers of the galaxy. Like that's woke. You know, like people don't like admitting it, like because you know, woke wasn't a thing. Woke wasn't a thing in the common vernacular back then, but it is true, right? The Asari are woke. You know, Mass Effect is a woke franchise. You know, the token conservative character, Ashley, is disrespected the entire trilogy, and like fans hate her. Why? Because she's a conservative, right? Like that is the reality of like Mass Effect. Like it is, I think, a precursor to everything we're witnessing now, right? And the thing now is, it does kind of feel like woke culture is beginning to die because people are noticing the patterns. People are noticing the behavior of the people who believe in the ideology, right? People are beginning to notice how it affects things they like. And I think most importantly, like people are beginning to realize that they don't necessarily need to consume all the products that come out, right? We're reaching the point where like the majority of the population aren't even consuming the most heavy-handed pieces of propaganda there is, right? There are handfuls of exceptions, but for the most part, the most blatant propaganda just gets like straight up passed out by most people because like it simply isn't entertaining. It's not fun, it's not engaging, it's not fresh, it's not original. Like there's no reason to be excited about the new Star Wars film, the new Star Trek film, the new like the new whatever, right? Like cuz it's all just terrible. Like it doesn't have anything to do with woke stuff, like the woke ideology itself. Like the problem inherently is that the product is not enjoyable. Like back in the 90s, they could put out stuff like Starship Troopers and people could unironically like get invested in it, even though like it's an obvious propaganda hit piece against like the iconic sci-fi 1959 novel, right? They could put out like things like Forrest Gump, which is like basically rewriting history. They could put out like Terminator 2 with its like girl boss female lead like Sarah Connor. Like they could do that, right? Like they used to be able to do it. And like they used to be able to get away with it because like, people had faith in them to deliver an interesting product. And yeah, like they can't do that anymore. Right? Like that is like the problem with modern entertainment in general is that like the talent, the creators don't have the ability to make compelling, interesting stories, right? They can't get people invested in the plot lines in spite of the nonsense, in spite of the agenda, in spite of what they're trying to like subliminally try to gaslight you into they can't manipulate you anymore because like you're not gonna sit down and watch their nonsense, right? And if you do, if you're like relatively like tuned in to like the current state of the world and like how these people like what these people are doing and stuff like that, like you will openly start rejecting it. You will start opposing it. You will be against it. And I think more and more that kind of thing is going to become more and more trendy, right? You're going to see people, more and more people watch older shows. You're going to see more and more people playing older games, reading manga, playing Japanese games, watching Japanese shows. The collapse of the industry is very, very real. And Sweet Baby Incorporated is only a very small part of that.